Hello everyone, this is Sage Blue, looking into some more detailed tuning of the Renault Clio, which I've been looking into for a little bit now, as people have seen my previous videos would know. And my previous video looked into just basically approaching car setup whilst learning a new track. So I didn't want to go into too much detail simply because I hadn't gone into too much detail myself with the car setups in project cars. So I didn't want to go into things where I hadn't even tested myself. So now I can actually go into a little bit more detail, more particularly with suspension, dampers, and camber as well in this case. So while I'm talking about the Renault Clio, there's not everything you can adjust that's available with car setups. It's one of the things I actually like about the Renault Clio Cup. It's more about racing, but there is a fair bit of uh, options for you to adjust the car to your liking to increase stability, for example, through corners, under braking, etc. So let's just get into it. Now, I'm going to use Zilton Park as an example here. One reason is because there's a lot of undulations, a lot of bumps, whether mid corner or even under braking, and it can really affect how your car performs over the lap. So I think it's a good example to use when it comes to setting up the car. Now, with turn one with Alton Park, now it's called Old Hall. It's a right-hander. The road surface just dips a little bit before you start getting into the apex, as you can see here. Now, the road surface isn't too bad. There's a few bumps, I think, during the braking zone, so softening the suspension can actually help with that. Now, if we look into suspension here on the tuning setup screen, okay, so here we go. We've got the options we've got to deal with is the front sway bar and the rear sway bar. Now, with these, the other ones that are greyed out obviously aren't available to tune with the Renault Clio, but that's okay. Now, with the sway bars, basically you limit the rolling of the actual car. So, and I don't mean simply rolling onto its roof. The car tends to tilt, just especially during, for example, reasonably fast corners. And Alton Park has plenty of turns where the car will be rolling quite a lot. Now, if there's a lot of rolling, you'll tend to lose stability with the car during the corner. So you may want to soften the sway bars and to increase stability. However, there is a downside to it. The vehicle's responsiveness to your, for example, your steering can be actually reduced. So it may take a touch longer to respond to what you want the car to do. Now, so basically, again, like in my previous video, it's trial and error. Find the right balance where you want maybe a bit of both responsiveness and uh, a little bit of tilting. It's a bit of compromise, or you may just really despise the tilting and just put up with the lack of responsiveness with the steering. So, everybody's different, and it's basically just take your pick with that. Now, with turn two, which is Denton's Corner, it's a right-hander, and you can see that on the screen now. It leads on to the third turn pretty soon after it, and the third turn cascades. It's a left-hander. Now, the braking zone into turn three is quite bumpy, and with the default car setup, for myself personally, I lacked confidence under brakes going into turn three. So the result of that is I ended up braking a lot earlier than the other cars, and Also, I even completed the braking before the corner. That's how little confidence I had in the car, especially on cold tyres and brakes. So the first lap was always a bit of a horror for me. And so I looked at a replay during a race at the AI cars, and they took a wider line going into that corner and going into the corner at higher speed than me. So not only they took the wider line so they can have a better exit out of the corner and also better mid-corner speed, they were also taking a faster speed into the corner, where I took a tighter line into the corner going over the curbs to try and get the car gripping onto the curbs, and and generally I should be having a faster entry, but instead they actually had a faster entry than I did, and from the wide line, and so I was losing out quite a bit at turn 3. And again, softening the sway bars for the Renault Clio will help you go over the bumps a bit as well. Another thing you can actually do is something that's called camber. Now, that relates to the angle of each wheel uh, in relation to the actual car itself. So, assume the car's, they're upright. Negative camber will have the wheel actually pointing inwards towards the car. So, uh, the top of the wheel will be angled, and what it actually does, it helps improve grip in corners. So when you compare the camber settings on the default settings, you may have, say, turns such as at Alton Park, there's hairpins, and there's other corners that I'll talk about later, where you really need a quick, tight turn in for a particular corner, and the camber can actually help with that quite a lot. Softening the sway bars along with it will help with the grip and to cope with to actually let you take advantage of the extra camber as well. So, moving on to Alton Park, now here's turn 4 called Island Bends. Now, it may look easy. It's just simply a left-handed bend. It's banked nicely. Default settings on the Renault Clio with a heavy fuel load on cold tyres and cold brakes. It's a lot more difficult than it looks. Personally, I was able to take it after a bit of practice fairly consistently. However, the car itself behaved inconsistently. And it's bumpy going through there. Just before the corner, I think from memory, it's a bit bumpy, and definitely in the corner, it's bumpy. And if you ride over the curb, again, it's bumpy. And in general, if you ride over any curbs at Alton Park, they are quite bumpy. It's reducing or I should say, softening the suspension or the sway bars. They will help you ride over those curbs more smoothly, keep the car more balanced so you don't lose so much speed, and actually help you control the car a lot more easily. So you can focus more on the racing rather than just trying to keep the car on track. Now, also with this turn, I remember with turn 4, when you exit out of turn 3 and you go on that straight leading on to turn 4, just before getting to turn 4, it's only then that I get into 6th gear on the Renault Clio. And it's slow acceleration from turn 3 to turn 4. And I'm just sitting there wondering, okay, this isn't feeling right. The other cars are accelerating quicker than I am along this little straight. And basically, that comes down to gear ratios. So gear ratios, you can set their length. So you can go for a longer gear ratio to try and achieve more top-end speed. However, acceleration is sacrificed because of that longer gear ratio. You can shorten the gear ratio, so it could be for the 5th gear, 6th gear, 4th gear, each one has its own ratio. And If you shorten the ratio, then you get generally better acceleration, but shorter top end speed for that particular gear. And trial and error for each track, each car, every car's different, every track demands different gear ratios. And for this particular straight between turn 3 and 4 at Alton Park, I found quite a bit that you'd have to reduce gear ratios for gears 5 and 6 most definitely, but I also found the fourth gear as well. So looking at gearing here, okay, so sixth gear, definitely put it down a notch, and whoops, fifth gear, put that down a notch, and fourth gear, I'd definitely put that down a notch a little bit as well. And generally, that'll give you better acceleration. You'll find yourself more competitive against the other cars coming out of turn 3, and you'll just get a better run leading on to turn 4. And that'll also, of course, improve your lap time as well. So it's you can find bits and pieces, to shave off your lap time and just be a lot more competitive. And you'll find you'll be able to race faster AI as well, especially if you're looking at the 100% AI or 90% AI. Okay, after turn 4, there's a section called Britons, and that's turns 7, 8, and 9. Now, this is actually there's a little bit to talk about here. The braking zone leading onto the left kink, which is turn 7, you can see here. Now, the braking zone is quite bumpy on the default car setup. If you've by now adjusted your sway bars for the suspension settings, and also if you have more negative camber compared to the default settings, you'll find yourself for a start with the suspension settings softened, your braking will be more smooth. And with the default setup, I found the car, if I put a lot of brakes on, I don't mean slam the brakes on, even just 80% or something, the car can twitch and I'd be dancing the car in the braking zone. It'll be just going a bit left and right, and I'm just trying to keep it going straight so I can get to the apex of that left-hander. And with the softened suspension, the braking's a lot smoother. Of course, you need to find that level of softness in the settings that you like. And when the car's more stable, it lets me position the car in a better place through that left-hander, which leads straight onto the right-hander after it, turn 8, which you can see. And with the softened suspension, if you touch that curb on turn 8, the right-hander, the car shouldn't bounce off so easily as it would with the default suspension settings. So it's something else to keep in mind. And also with turn 8, the extra negative camber can help with the turn-in into turn 8. With the default settings for the camber and default settings for suspension, I found getting to the apex for turn 8 was quite difficult. I often did get it, but sometimes I'd miss it simply because the car was so unstable from the braking zone going into turn 7 that I just couldn't recover in time. And the reason I'm going through all of this is not only you're just losing time in turns 7 and 8 with the default car settings, it's you lose momentum through turns 8 and then turns 9, the left-hander right after turn 8. As you can see, turn 9 leads onto that little hill, and the Renault Clio doesn't have the most powerful engine. So it struggles to gain speed up that hill if you have low revs. And if you've lost momentum through turn 7 and 8 and you're exiting turn 8 through low revs and starting to go up that hill, chances are the other cars are going to have high revs and accelerate much more nicely up that hill and build a lead on you. So it's a bit of a double whammy. So try and keep the car as smooth as possible through the braking zone heading into turn 7. And then the extra camber helps with turn 8. And then you have better momentum heading through turn 9 up the hill. So you'll find yourself saving quite a bit of time there. Okay, the next turn, turn 10. Now, I haven't had really any problems with the default settings getting into there. However, after making the changes I've previously mentioned, I can brake later, I find, and just have more confidence going over the curb through turn 10. Whereas with the default settings, I didn't really have much confidence at all because often the car would just bounce off and I'd go on two wheels. So, and whenever that happens, you lose momentum, speed generally, and then you lose momentum heading into the left-hander right after it, which is turn 11. And it's the same story as with the previous section I mentioned, so of those three corners. Also, with that left-hander you see there, softening the suspension, it helps you go over that curb, whereas the default settings you generally avoid the curb because the car will just bounce off and you can go on two wheels. Not guaranteed to do that, but often you'd find that happening. And with the softer suspension, if you take the right line and go over that curb, you can shave off a bit more time off your lap time. So it's with Alton Park in general, I think softer suspension's definitely the right way to go, and definitely more negative camber. Okay, now one more thing, dampers. So okay, you can see the bump stops are greyed out. They're not available for the Renault Clio, but basically it's to avoid the car bottoming out on the track. So basically just increase the ride height enough to avoid that, and just basically compromise between how much, how high you want the car, and uh, the effects that it has on stability as well. So increasing the height of the car. Now with the slow bumps and the slow and fast rebumps and slow and fast rebounds, you can see the descriptions there. With the bumps, basically, uh, you can adjust it for whether you want it softer or stiffer. It affects the how much oversteer or understeer you have, and also affects the responsiveness. So if you have, say, more understeer, then the car can be less responsive heading into a corner, whereas more oversteer, the car can turn more sharply. It's the same sort of thing I was talking about with camber, the sort of end result that you want. It behaves a bit differently. Obviously, dampers are a different thing to camber, but uh, if you want the car to turn more sharply, you can achieve that with stiffer bump settings, and that'll give you more oversteer and a sharper turn in, which might be helpful with Alton Park. And as you can see, the settings here for the front, left and front right, they're quite stiff. Same with the rear ones as well. Now, if we look at the rebounds, this is for all four, the rears and the fronts. Now, it's basically, it's if you want oversteer or understeer into a corner uh, while going over the bumps. So if you want to stiffen the fronts basically and soften the rears, basically it helps reduce oversteer, and it works the other way around, as you can see there in the description in the main area on the screen. So it's a bit more detail. It's probably, I wouldn't get into that before setting the suspension and the camber, because they do a lot for you. And once you start fine tuning the details, then get into this sort of thing, I would recommend. It's but it's, I have to say, with Project Cars, these descriptions are great, because I remember playing other racing simulators where I had to research what each of these things actually did, whereas here it's just a fairly concise explanation as to how things work. Now, if it's your first time ever getting into a racing simulator and you've never, and you haven't driven a real racing car, then this will all be new to you, obviously, and you'll probably still want to go online to read a bit more about how things work. However, when you make adjustments here and then you can feel the differences out on track, there's nothing better than learning that way. It's so if you just go out, make a few changes here, then go out for a few laps, make sure the tyres and brakes warm up so you can get a good idea of how the car really performs, not just simply on your out lap, which will be on cold tyres and brakes, then yeah, you can get a good idea of the effects each thing has. And remember, once you learn how these things work, you can apply that knowledge to other tracks. So doing, for example, in this case, the Renault Clio Cup, future races in the Renault Clio Cup, you'll know how to approach it. So different tracks, but for example, if you come across another braking zone that's bumpy, you'll know what sort of adjustments to make the car more stable going over those bumps heading into the corner. I hope this all helps you guys, and it's more detailed than my previous video. Obviously, it's the previous video, as I said, that was more for just getting into the race weekends, learning the track, how to approach it, what you want out of the car, getting your racing lines right, which takes you a long way. However, with a track like Oulton Park, even getting the right line the car's so unstable in some corners with the default setup that it's essential really to get a good car setup so you can have the car behaving consistently lap after lap and just simply being more comfortable to drive, so there's less chance of you making any driving errors during a long race. So there you go. That's a little look at car setup with the Renault Clio. I hope it helps. And there's plenty more videos to come, including a race of the Renault Clio at Oulton Park as well, so you can just see it in action. And if you like these videos, feel free to subscribe because there's plenty more stuff to come. Until next time.